everybody. Welcome to the second week of class. And today we're going to be talking about different developmental theories. And the first thing I want to talk about is what is a theory? And theories of development are helping us explain about how the world works. The theories suggest how or why people change or remain the same over time, but they're not facts. Theories can help us and guide us in research, but they're absolutely not facts in terms of this theory is reality. So I really want to make sure to emphasize the difference between a theory and that it can drive research, but it is not research. Okay, the first thing we're going to talk about is theories about what motivates us. There are some specific theories about motivation, and they're referred to as psychodynamic theories because they suggest the psychological needs motivate our actions. And these include Freud's psychosexual theory and Erikson's psychosocial theory. We're going to start with Freud. And most of you have heard of Freud. He was alive from 1856 to 1939, which means he grew up during the Victorian era in England, World War I, and basically the start of World War II. And he lived in a time when genetics was a popular explanation for human behavior. And they believed that many behaviors were believed to be instinctive, so we were born with the behaviors. But Freud studied an ailment, something called hysteria. And hysteria was originally thought to be a disorder only women suffered, and it was referred to as the disease of the wandering womb because of the Greeks thought it resulted from the womb being dislocated in the body. When men began to suffer from hysteria-like symptoms, it was believed that only genetically inferior men were vulnerable. And Freud found that the genetic explanations for this disorder, marked by physical writhing and uncontrollable emotion, were basically inadequate. It wasn't enough. And they also found that many of the men suffering from hysteria had some common symptoms and that they all served in the war together, and that was trauma from the war. And so when he started talking to the men about the trauma and their fears, he found that their symptoms started to dissipate. And he invented what many call the talking cure. And he believed that early childhood experiences were often the source of mental anguish, and he emphasized the importance of parenting for shaping personality. Now remember, this is the first time where they are really looking at the fact that personality is something you're not necessarily born with, but could be shaped by parents. So Freud described a variety of defense mechanisms, or ways to distort and therefore be able to handle painful truths. I'm going to go through these rather quickly because they're more in detail in the modules. So repression is to avoid thinking about something that is upsetting. Regression basically involves returning to a time in life when you felt safe. Perhaps it means going back to revert back to your childhood psychologically. Rationalization is the use of seemingly logical explanations to explain the painful truth. Denial is basically lying to yourself. Sublimation involves transforming unacceptable urges. So what that means is you want to transform something into an acceptable behavior, such as exercise or competition, if you're a very competitive person. Displacement involves carrying out frustration into a safer target. Like if you've ever been upset with something very simple, it may be a sign of displacing your frustration that it's really about something else. Projection is the tendency to attribute your feelings onto others. And reaction formation involves outwardly opposing something you desire or yet fear. So there's 3 parts to the self, according to Freud. And these are really interesting. It's called the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the part of the self that's inborn. It responds to biological urges, and it's guided by the principle of pleasure. So let's say you want to buy a purse and you don't have the money for it, but you still want to buy the purse and you feel so good that you bought the purse. That would be your id that allowed you to buy the purse. Now your ego develops through interaction with others and is guided by logic or the reality principle. So we're going to go back to that purse again. You see that name brand purse and you really want it and you're going to buy it, and then your ego steps in and says you don't have the money for it, so you're not going to buy it. But then there's something that's called the superego that is kind of about guilt, and it's about your values and moral and your conscience. So I'm going to go back to the purse again and say you want to buy the purse, you really want it, but your ego is saying you can't afford it, don't buy it. Your super ego might say, hey, you could put it on layaway and pay it off every month, and then you can own the purse. So it's kind of a compromise, the super ego. Freud created something called the psychosexual development, and he believed that there were 5 stages of it. And the 5 stages is the oral stage, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. And same thing, I'm going to go through them kind of quickly. The oral stage lasts from birth until around 2, and it basically focuses on sucking and the mouth and having the needs met in that way. The anal stage coincides with potty training or learning to manage biological urges. And they say that anal fixation may result in a person who is compulsively clean and organized or one who's sloppy and lacks self-control. The phallic stage occurs in early childhood and marks the development of the superego and a sense of masculinity or femininity. Latency occurs during middle childhood when a child urges quiet down and friendships become the focus. And the ego and superego can be refined during that time. And the genital stage begins with puberty and continues through adulthood and with the preoccupation of sex and reproduction. Freud focused on biology as a prime motivator, and because that was his way of what motivated people. Erikson suggested that our relationships and society's expectations motivate much of our behavior. So he basically took part of Freud's theory and turned it into his psychosocial development. Erikson was a student of Freud's, but emphasized the importance of the ego or conscious thought in determining our actions. In other words, he believed that we are not driven by unconscious urges. We know what motivates us, and we unconsciously think about how to achieve our goals. He is considered the father of developmental psychology because his model gives us guidelines for the entire lifespan and suggests certain primary physiological and social concerns throughout life. Erikson had 4 stages of development. Actually, I'm sorry, there's actually 6, but I'm going to go over 4 in this one. The first one is trust versus mistrust, and it's the crisis of infancy. The infant's dependent and hopes that his needs are met, and if so, the infant may gain a sense that the world is a trustworthy place. Autonomy versus shame and doubt is the struggle of toddlers. Once the toddlers can walk and talk, he wonders where he can go and what can be said. The ability to be independent within safe limits is the goal here. Then there's initiative versus guilt, and it guides early childhood. The child wants to plan and begin a task or project without assistance. Maybe it's building a fort out of the couch, and he wants to be able to figure out on his own how to do it. Next is industry versus inferiority, which is the primary concern once a child is learning how to get along with other children and begins participating in school or other endeavors in which children come together and are compared. Industry involves being very busy and trying out one's skills. Then there's something about identity versus role confusion, and this is very easy to think about. It's like, think about teenagers. They struggle with the question of who am I? Who am I socially, physically, sexually, morally, academically, and so on. The early adult is focused on intimacy versus isolation. Once an identity has been established, the person is in a better position to make intimate long-term commitments. And then there's generativity or productivity and a sense of giving back. And that's basically that the next generation are concerned during during midlife or much of adulthood. A person looks at their life and hopes to be doing something that is worthwhile. If not, they feel stagnated or stuck and they're impelled to make some changes. And then there's integrity versus adults. And this is integrity versus despair, and this happens with the late adults. And it concerns the end of life. And we want to look back and think that we've lived according to our beliefs. We want to see agreement between who we are and what we've done. If not, we may experience a sense of despair about time running out. So here's a portion where you can kind of test yourself, but I'm not going to go into this as part of the lecture right now, but you can look at these questions and see if you're able to really think about them. Next, we're going to focus on learning theories. And these explain some of the ways that experiences change what we're capable of doing. Unlike psychodynamic theories, learning theories focus on behaviors that are observable. And we're going to explore 3 theories: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning theory. First, we're going to start with classical conditioning. And many of you may have heard of the name Ivan Pavlov. And he is the one who discovered that certain cues in our environment can create automatic physiological responses in us. For example, if you think of lemons, you may start to salivate and your mouth may pucker. The reason is because you're associating the word lemon with your experiences when tasting a lemon. Now, the word can bring the same response. Classical conditioning occurs when we learn from association. The reaction is a gut level physiological response like heart rate, relaxation, respiration, and other ways that our body changes when experiencing an emotion. Our sympathetic and parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system are engaged. Pavlov's understanding of classical conditioning developed out of his work when he was studying how saliva breaks down food. Here's one of Pavlov's dogs. Notice that this dog has a tube attached to his mouth. This is designed to capture saliva that can be measured when the dog is eating. Pavlov noticed that the dogs produce saliva even before he introduced food. For example, they began to salivate when they heard his assistant coming down the hall. Why? Because they know that the footsteps come right before the food. Therefore, their bodies are getting ready to digest by producing salivation. So Pavlov called this a psychic reflex, and he began to pair other stimuli to feeding. He rang a bell just before feeding, and this pairing made it so that when the dog heard the bell, he would start to salivate. Let's review some terms by applying these to the experiment just described. Before conditioning has occurred, we see that dogs naturally produce saliva when food is introduced. The unconditional stimulus is the food, and the unconditional response is salivation. After the bell has become associated with food, the dog begins to salivate when hearing the bell. The conditioned or learned stimulus is now the sound of the bell, and the conditioned or learned response is to salivate to the sound of the bell. So we can go beyond this now and look beyond dogs and salivation and maybe apply it to other people, because we care about Pavlov's dogs, but let's take that information from the dogs and say, can we apply this to people? So Watson and behaviorism built on Pavlov's work. He was considered a parenting expert. In the 1920s and wrote a column in the newspaper giving parenting advice. He rejected the idea that genetics explained our actions. Rather, he thought that learning was key in determining how children behave. Consequently, he emphasized the importance of parenting practices. He believed that children should be taught to love or hate anything associated with conditioned stimuli. He demonstrated this in his work with little Albert by teaching Albert to be afraid of a variety of animals and other objects after they've been associated with a loud noise, which Albert automatically feared. And I apologize for my phone ringing while I'm doing this. So how does this turn into anything? Advertisers. Watson left academia and carried his message to the world of advertising. One of his first clients was Sunkist, a company who sold oranges. Watson created an ad in which a beautiful woman was shown holding an orange. Think about this example and identify the unconditional stimulus, the conditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response for review. And it really is amazing how much of advertising has had to do with operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is an explanation of why we repeat voluntary actions or operants. For example, you're working through this lesson. What did you do? Perhaps you raised your hand. When you're in a class and the teacher asks a question and you raise your hand and the teacher smiles at you, that's actually a reinforcement that encourages you to want to do the action again. Law effect states that an organism will repeat an action if it's followed by a good effect. So if I were with you now, I might be able to smile when you stood up and basically increase the likelihood that you would stand again. So reinforcers. Reinforcers have to do with wanting to encourage a behavior to be continued. So Skinner is the person who really brought to our attention about reinforcers. A reinforcement is anything that an organism desires and is motivated to obtain. And a reinforcer is something that encourages or promotes a behavior. Some things are natural rewards. They're considered intrinsic or primary because their value is easily understood. While extrinsic or secondary reinforcers are things that have a value not immediately understood. Their value is indirect and they can be traded in for what is ultimately desired. So positive reinforcement. This involves adding something to a situation in order to encourage a behavior. For example, if I give a child a cookie for cleaning a room, the addition of the cookie makes cleaning more likely in the future. A negative reinforcement is subtracting something to continue a behavior. So for example, I have an alarm clock that makes a very unpleasant sound. When it goes off in the morning, as a result, I get up and I turn it off, and by removing the noise, I'm reinforced for getting up. And then there's punishment, which most of us know because many of us were punished growing up. It's an effort to stop a behavior. It means to follow an action with something unpleasant or painful. And we have actually found that punishment is less effective than reinforcement for several reasons. It doesn't indicate the desired behavior. It may result in suppressing rather than stopping behavior. And it focuses on punishing can result in not noticing when a person does well. And we found that when there's something positive that we can find about someone doing well, it'll encourage them to continue that behavior because people like getting the positives. We're going to go into what the social learning theory is. Basically, social learning theory occurs when we learn from watching others. It's called modeling. Perhaps you started a new job or you became a parent. One of the ways to learn how to behave in these situations is to watch someone else in this role. And Albert Bandura, in the video clip of the Bobo doll, which will be part of, you may have already watched it or you'll watch it after this, you can see what happens with the Bobo doll and aggression. I also want you to think about how you learned how to kiss, to drive, to be afraid of the dark, or to do your job. Is this something you're born with? Or is this something that you modeled, that you imitated? Someone who was around you was afraid of the dark, so you became afraid of the dark. You watched someone do their job well, so you imitated how to do the job well. So a lot of how we learn is through social learning. We're going to go into cognitive theories now, and that's about how thinking changes over time. I'm going to go pretty fast because we're going to spend much more time on Vygotsky and Piaget. So Piaget is considered the father of cognitive psychology, and he really looked at how children think and reason, and he believed that they learn about the world by interacting with the world, and that through these interactions they're learning, and it's about manipulation. So many of you have heard of the Montessori approach to learning, and that would be the Piaget approach. I'm going to not go into detail on schema and assimilation equilibrium because we're going to spend more time on them later, but understand that the whole point of the child is they're trying to reach equilibrium in the balance of what we see and what we know. Piaget believed in 4 stages of cognitive development. Sensory motor is from birth to 2, pre-operational is from 2 to 7, concrete operational is from 7 to 11, and formal operational is from 11 to adulthood. Next, I want to go into Vygotsky. Same thing, we're going to spend a little more time on Vygotsky and Piaget later on in the semester, but he's a Russian psychologist who he basically focused specifically on how children learn through social interacting with adults and their environment. It's not just through interacting with the environment like Piaget felt, but specifically about interacting with the adults as well. And he believed that cognitive abilities are acquired through guidance and interaction with others. And this interaction involves scaffolding in which the child or apprentice is given hands-on assistance along with the explanation as they learn to perform a task. The key is to work with the child within their zone of proximal development. And the zone of proximal development is kind of where the child can get to. It's like where they're comfortable, and then we can help them get to the next level. And we're going to go over Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems model. And what I love about Bronfenbrenner is he took pieces from Freud and Erikson and Piaget and the learning theorists, and he basically believed that all of these theories could be enhanced by adding the dimensions of the context. So when you look at the ecological systems model, that purple portion in the center, that's the child, and you can see everything is interacting with the child around the child. So the microsystem is what impacts the child directly. And these are the people with whom the child interacts with, such as parents and peers and teachers. The next one out is called the mesosystem, and these are the interactions between those surrounding the individual. The relationship between parents and schools will indirectly affect the child. Then we go to the exosystem, And the exosystem is the larger institutions such as mass media or the healthcare, and how they then have another impact. And then we find cultural values and beliefs at the level of the macro system. And these larger ideals and expectations inform institutions that will ultimately impact the individual. All of this happens in a historic context referred to as the chronosystem, which is about the cultural values change over time, as do policies of the education institutes or governments in certain political climates. Development occurs at a point in time. And the example that I'm going to give is just learning math. Many of us learned math very differently from the others because depending on the pressures from the government, how they were feeling that children were learning math and science compared to the rest of the world, and the pressure on the teachers and how they were going to teach math, and the different curriculum that was picked up by the school system the child was in, all of that impacts the child, and then the child's relationship with the teacher and how the teacher teaches the child also impacts how the child's learning math. So I want to bring that up, that all has an impact on how the child's learning. Anyway, happy learning this week, and please, please, please ask tons of questions. Thanks.